All right, welcome everyone to my second of a series where I'm going to be talking about Chinese genealogical records in Canada. And I'm going to be going through some of the hundreds of slides that I've been preparing. But first, a little bit about me. If you haven't heard about me before, I'm a fourth generation Chinese Canadian on two sides of my family, one of them being Yip Sang. I just released the second edition of Getting Started in Chinese Genealogy, and so I was really excited about that this week. I am a member of the Ancestry Board of Canadian Genealogists. I'm also a member of a handful of societies around North America, and I am pursuing accreditation through ICAPGen, which is a lot of work, but incredibly useful already, and I've been accepted into the study group. All right, now, introductions, we've already had introductions, so I'm just going to skip over that part, but please do save your comments and questions to the end. I have an exciting bit of news about NARA records myself, which I received yesterday. Exciting. Okay, so last month we talked about the first 5 tips, which quickly I will go through. When you do a family tree, we start with ourselves, we go backwards. In the first talk, I talked a lot about processes, whether you're paper, electronic, and the software, and that kind of decision that you want to make. Beginning at the end means when we're researching our ancestor, we want to research from their decease to their birth, the most recent to the more distant. The reason being, it is easier to find records and documentation as we go backwards into the past, as opposed to starting in the past and attempting to come forward. Number 4 is planning to talk to your family. And in that, I encapsulated that when I started talking to my family, first of all, I didn't prepare, I didn't do my research, I didn't have my questions, and I didn't really know what I was getting into. And so honestly, it is better for you to be informed, an informed genealogist, before you start approaching your relatives, so that they don't feel blindsided later by your questions. And also, be polite and ask, hey, next month I'd really love to get together and talk about, Gong Gong or Ya's time in growing up. Okay, so the next 5, and then become a fan of FAN. FAN is friends, associates, and neighbors. What I'm saying is, in Chinese genealogy, we are cluster researchers. That means that we often can't find the person that we're looking for in a direct line research basis. And so if you're finding stonewalled or brickwalled because you're stuck on the person that you're researching, take heart. It is possible to get around that through cluster research, through searching people who are cousins, people in the community. I'm doing this kind of work myself on 3 different projects. And so let's start off with number 6. Okay, so in Chinese genealogy, because we are dealing with language and culture issues, be a little bit skeptical about what you're reading. It takes some time to get attuned to the documents. And one of the things in Chinese genealogy that we often wrestle with is the name. The name, it's the center of genealogy. It's the name search basis that we look for in records. And not everyone is entirely aware that the name spelling in English or Romanized, the Romanized alphabet, is not necessarily the name. Actually, it is not the actual name. The real name is the name in Chinese, the Chinese character. And so that is the thing that we are all looking for. And so documents may have people to be as kind as possible. Let's start with kind. That people who recorded records in the past were unfamiliar with Chinese culture. They were not familiar with the plethora of Chinese languages. They couldn't hear the tones and sounds. They didn't know the names. They weren't aware of the many name formats where a Chinese person, especially a male, may have been born with one name, may have acquired a different name upon reaching an age of maturity, and may have adopted a different name upon marriage, and may have adopted a style name, that's four, upon achieving, say, some significant event. So for example, my great-grandfather had a style name when he became a well-to-do and wealthy merchant. It was quite different from the name that he was known by. And honestly, until relatively recently, I did not know that my great-grandfather's name and the name that we all know him by, Yip Sang, is not actually his name. His name is Yip Chung Tin. And so the other is the fifth major name category I would like to mention here is the Ah form of the name, where Chinese amongst themselves called each other by an Ah form, like Ah Tat. And that actually, the Ah form is not a name. It's like uncle, or it's like old Charlie. It's like Bucktooth Jim, because certainly Cantonese people were very familiar and invented nicknames for each other. And so the name that you might have on a document, it might be your person, but it might actually have the nickname on the document in English. And so for that, I advise that we collect all the different name formats until you get really familiar with what the names are. And then now we're going to go from unfamiliarity into kind of more hardening of bias, where newspapers, especially about a century ago, I have read thousands of articles at this point, and newspapers had a bias. Actually, newspapers today have a bias, and the bias is to sell newspapers. And so the more salacious, 100 years ago, you know, the top headlines were really, you know, a celebratory or fear-based. A lot about war, a lot about pandemics, very familiar. And unfortunately, a lot of news articles around a century ago, they really hyper focus on threats from the Chinese. And so I find that while I did have a huge amount of articles from my search into newspapers.com and also the British Colonist, which is the University of Victoria collection, that about one in, let's say 20 articles would actually mention the person by name. Mostly the articles would talk about people, but not to them. It wasn't really an interview. They were reporting about, you know, Chinese gets robbed, Chinese store gets burgled. Even my own great-grandfather, who had a name and was well known, I found articles about him that just called him rich Chinese merchant. And I had to triangulate that it was probably him based on other details. And so you will also need to get familiar with geographic details, because that will be really important. Finally, there was a systemic bias. Immigration systems, I'm going to focus on, well, Canada and the United States honestly did work together with the Chinese Immigration Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that was to control the movement of Chinese in North America. So immigration systems produce papers to control Chinese movement, both into and out of the country, yes. And that's where most people, I think, have an understanding of the Chinese Immigration Act, because it's right in the name. But what is less well known is that the Chinese Immigration Bureau in Canada certainly was a huge, well-funded, many-peopled bureaucracy, and it produced a lot of different papers. And so the head tax certificates, there were dozens of them, and the Chinese exit certificates. And so those were all part of the Chinese immigration system in Canada. Secondly, census systems. Right now in Canada, the 1921 is the most recent national census available. The next one, the sorry, the 1931 census will be coming out in 2023. So we have a little ways to wait, unlike Americans who are anticipating their 1950 census. Anyway, but you will find when you go into census records, which are some of the richest records available for us, that you will likely not be able to search them by name. I just covered the whole name bias, but I personally, I know my people, I know where they are, and I have had to search census records based on, I'm looking for a merchant, I'm looking for a tailor, I know they're in New Westminster, I know they're in Chinatown, and I've had to learn the sub-districts of New Westminster. I was looking for Duke Sang Wong, for example, and I knew because of his book, which furnished so many different details, where he was and when he was. Two very important factors. And using the fact that I knew he was there, I knew it was New Westminster, I knew that it would be 1891. And so I went through 7 sub-districts in New Westminster to find his. And it was because they didn't hear his name properly. It's actually transcribed on that census as Lack, L-A-C-K, Sam, S-A-M, which actually isn't that far from Duke Sang, if you think about it. And I was able to match his children because I knew his children's ages and their genders. And so it's that kind of thing when we're looking at systems. And so being skeptical about documents means if you have even a positive document, be careful with it, because Chinese are millions of people, a billion people now, with very similar names. And so just because you find, say, a Yip, I actually have an example, which I'll talk about at the end of this talk, narrow records, where I requested a narrow record. I was pretty sure that was my family. And now that I read the record, I realize it's not. And so I have very similar names. And then legal systems, which I've already touched on. So be warned. I find the more I delve into Chinese ancestry, the more it rewards. It is incredibly enlightening and fulfilling and amazing to do this work, to find a document, to help people find their family, because I don't know about you, but my family were really not able to talk about what happened to them. Neither of my parents, and I did ask a lot of questions, even my grandparents. And I did mention I'm 4th generation. And so we all grew up in Canada, and yet they were still not able to really explain what happened. And so as you do the work, you find a document which raises some questions. Let's just say you find a CI-9, which is a Chinese Immigration Reentry Certificate. And it has your name, your grandfather's name on it, and it has all these wealth of details, but immediately it's what is this document? Why does this document exist? What was the process around this document? And so the process is searching for the sources, and then you find them, and then you learn about the sources, and then you get even more curious because it just goes off in 100 directions, and then learning and searching some more. And so it's very much a process of growth. So be patient. And everything you learn will spark more questions, which leads me to be patient. I find that when I do other branches of genealogy, I've done French, Dutch, I've done my husband's Irish, English, Old Ontario, Quebec, and Métis, and all of those branches of records had more records than Chinese genealogy. In fact, when I was doing my husband's Northern Irish records, it was really easy. I mean, it felt really easy because there were so many records. And so you can get the same data point. So for example, my husband didn't know very much about his maternal grandfather because he died when his mother, my husband's mother, was a baby girl. And so she didn't know anything about him either. But when I found the Northern Irish records, it's like I could find 5 different sources that talked about him going to school. And that was amazing. And so it's layer upon layer upon layer of documents. I don't find that to be the case in Chinese genealogy. At this point, I think I will talk a little bit about American records and Canadian records. So Marissa is here in the audience today, and she introduced me to Chinese Exclusion Act records and their wealth of detail. Not only did our long-running conversation back and forth introduce me to and what an amazing resource they were, but it also encouraged me to go to Salt Lake City to take the inaugural Chinese ancestry course at SLIG, the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy. And there Marissa spoke about her expertise, which are the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA records. And that conversation, which continues today, has how shall I put this, encouraged me to go to Library and Archives Canada to look for similar records. And guess what? They exist. However, it's a big however, they're not as readily accessible. And so I have half a dozen Freedom of Information requests for Chinese Immigration Act case files, which are absolutely at Library and Archives Canada, but are barred behind privacy legislation. Okay, so that's frustrating. It's frustrating to know that they exist, and it's frustrating not to be able to access them. And also coronavirus. The COVID has locked down archives, and LAC has taken the opportunity not to serve the public who are all at home searching records, but rather to lay off all of their temporary staff, all of their consultants. And so now they're I mean, they were on a shoestring before, and they're now even further back. But what this taught me is it was perhaps possible to look at Chinese people's records through NARA. In other words, if they ever went into the United States, there might be a NARA file for them. And so I have been exploring and expanding that technique, and I currently have a couple dozen NARA files of Canadian citizens who went to the United States for whatever reason before 1942, I think, and there is a case file for them. Not only that, but I hired an American researcher to look at Canadian cities and their likely departure point and which NARA office their file was likely to be. And so I'll be talking about that later on this year because I still need to work out that process. So this is very much a new field, and I am always incredibly humbled and grateful for people who are able to teach me more tools and tips and tricks in this branch of genealogy. And what I want to say is everything that you find, whether it's in a document, a census, a record, it is precious and it is worth deep analysis. And so here I'm going to break off and tell you a quick story. My girlfriend and I have been looking into her family, Elaine, and thanks to me, she has been on the lookout for records, because the truth is a lot of our records, they're in attics, they're in boxes, they're in the garage. In fact, the manuscript for Duke Sang Wong was literally in Wanda Jo Hoy's basement for decades. And so on the lookout for these things, Elaine went into her mother's old bedroom and started going through the drawers and found Zeller's. Does anyone remember Zeller's? Zeller's bags of shopping receipts. And so she went through them. She didn't immediately think it was junk. And lo and behold, she found her grandfather's Chinese registration card as a citizen of China. So I'm just going to stop there because I could keep going down this rabbit hole of what that is and what it means. But the important point is you may have family records hidden somewhere in a bag of Zeller's receipts. So please keep an eye out for these things, and please have a look when you can, because the time to be looking for these records is not at the end, where another of my girlfriends, unfortunately, is helping her mom move into an assisted living place, and she is under the gun to clear out her mother's house. She doesn't have time to go through papers. She's got to get rid of stuff. This is how records get lost. So, okay. And at the same time, so Chinese genealogy is incredibly fruitful if we can find clues to find our Jiapu. Now, a Jiapu is a family tree book. A Zupu is a community history book. A family tree book is a book of your family's surname. And while many Jiapu were lost during the Cultural Revolution, if we can find our family ancestry to get over that missing piece in the middle, call it the, say, 60-year gap between about 1920 to 1980, because I'm assuming that we know our more recent history, then maybe we can connect to our own Jiapu. And more of these family trees are being digitized at an astounding rate by Family Search, both at the Family Search website, in the China Collection of Genealogies, and in the Shanghai Library, which I talk about in my book. I give you tips and tricks for searching the Shanghai Library, which is in Chinese, in English. And if you can find that, boom, it is well worth the work. Okay, so don't do what I did. Don't do this alone. Join groups. It's so much more fun to join genealogy groups and just geek out. You can talk about DNA, you can talk about SNPs, you can use acronyms like SLIG, and people know exactly what you're saying. Genealogy a la carte by Gail Dever has an amazing list. Every year she puts out in a collated list of all the genealogy groups on Facebook. And so there are hundreds, if not maybe thousands at this point. You're welcome to join my group, Genealogy for Asian Canadians, if you're not already there. Or, search on Facebook for a group of your forebears. I'm a member of 3 groups for Taishan. And now I think I might be looking for groups because I suspect that my grandmother is Hakka, possibly. Anyway, so join societies, get involved, start talking to other people, because together we are smarter. We can share. It's like a rocket fuel booster under your genealogy and available to all. So when you first get into genealogy, it's super exciting. And I have spent untold hundreds of hours every weekend, just like over my computer, just needlessly searching at the end. And the thing is, you will forget everything that you found. You will. And you will forget why you took that SNP. You will forget why you have that newspaper article. You will not remember the connection because you went down a rabbit hole, and this connects to this and that connects to that, and over and over. And so do please keep notes. It doesn't have to be really complicated in the beginning. A title, a date, the URL, a screen cap, and why you thought that was important. I am a person who has over 20,000 notes, which kind of span the history of Chinese in Canada at this point. My personal tree is 2,000, it's over 2,000, well over 2,000 people, but documented I have just over 2,000. And what I'm finding is that honestly, we really are connected. If we are the historic Chinese Canadians, we're pretty much connected. And so incredibly rewarding. And resources. Have a look at past presents, where I have, I counted it up this morning, over 80 different links and resources for Chinese genealogy. Most of them are free, and they're not just links, but they explain what the links are for, because I personally get a little confused when I just see a big list of links and I don't know why I should be clicking on that link. Also, there's a quick reference glossary of words. Another plug for my book, and which is on sale to honor Lunar New Year. And I am developing a video library to teach Chinese genealogy, because honestly, my why, I want to make it easier for people coming after me, because this has been super hard, super rewarding, but super hard too. Thank you for listening. And now we'll open it up to questions, and I'll stop recording.